Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on the 2013 reboot of Tomb Raider 10 years after its initial release, which is a game I didn't get around to playing until a few years after its initial release. Playing the definitive version on PS4, but when I did, I really ended up loving this game, playing it numerous times in a row. Now, I am someone with no connection to the rest of the Tomb Raider series, but am a massive Uncharted fan, and this game really felt like a progression of that Uncharted formula, which I can understand how this can be underwhelming for old school fans of Tomb Raider. I know very well about adoring the early games of a franchise, only for that franchise to get hung up on attempting to copy a popular modern franchise. However, in contrast to my opinions of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I really genuinely think that Tomb Raider 2013 is a good game that innovates upon the formula it adapts instead of just doing a watered down imitation, while telling a compelling story, this coming of age story and origin story for Lara Croft, which, taking this game as its own individual experience, I do really like this first entry in the now dubbed Survivor trilogy. The problem is that I don't like the other two as much, which maybe I'll talk about eventually. But again, I'll be talking about my thoughts on this game coming from the perspective of someone who hasn't played the original games and only the rebooted trilogy here. So gameplay wise, again, you can clearly see the influence that this game had from Uncharted right away, particularly in its gameplay loop, mixing third-person shooter combat sections with environmental puzzles and parkour and climbing based traversal, all wrapped in a mostly linear cinematic action-adventure game. But again, I do feel like this game is so much more than that, where outside of this game's cinematic nature, I do feel like this game expands upon what Uncharted did in most aspects. Now, the biggest of this game's modifications to this formula is how this game is structured, where like the Uncharted games, the main campaign is still this cinematic linear experience, but the actual world isn't this continuing string of set pieces as it is on Uncharted, even though those do exist here. Instead, the game does take place in an open world, but one that funnels you through it during the main campaign, and while you can deviate from the main story to do side objectives at points, the main campaign still feels like a handcrafted experience here, where your navigation through it doesn't feel like you're slogging your way through the open world just to get to your main story quests. When in reality, that is still what is happening here, but I think a massive boon here is the fact that the world here was built to facilitate its main campaign, instead of the main campaign being thrown inside of this pre-built world, which is the way that I feel like most open world games are structured. Now, traversal in this game is also more varied than in the Uncharted games, where this game does add the utilization of tools that make it more than just jumping from ledge to ledge, with Lara having a climbing axe and you can use rope arrows, and through that adds a lot more variety here. And overall, I do really like how this world is designed, having these larger hub areas that are broken off by more linear paths, feeling structured like a Metroidvania game with areas blocked off until you have the right tools later in the story. You can also fast travel from campfires, which in itself also acts as a cool narrative addition here, with interacting with them, allowing you to hear Lara's inner thoughts. And obviously this overall structure does allow for the addition of side content, with collectibles like relics and documents. You have weapon parts that by collecting them, you get a new weapon, obviously better than the preset ones. But the best side content ends up being the challenge tombs, these set piece based puzzle sections that have some more innovative puzzles in the game. And overall, I do feel like this game has some pretty strong puzzle design. Though realistically, I don't find any of the puzzles in this game to be as memorable as those in the Uncharted games, but the puzzles are probably more complex here, with, again, in Uncharted, it feels like most of those puzzles are based around memorization or patterns, while in this game, the puzzles are more so based on physics or using elements like fire that can make these puzzles have more variety to them. And this game has its own version of eagle vision as well, like most modern games, and there being survival instincts that help you see the important objects during puzzles, which I can get how people could see this as dumbing down the puzzles, though I personally don't have an issue with it. But now let's talk about the combat, where on paper it is similar to that of the Uncharted games, with it being a third-person shooter, but really that's where the similarities end here, where the game does have a greater focus on stealth, both from the use of the axe for stealth kills, but also through the use of the bow and arrow, which becomes Lara's signature weapon throughout this trilogy, which in itself I know is controversial considering the OGs revolving around the use of guns, though I personally don't have an issue with it within this game, as I do feel like it serves a narrative purpose. Though I can understand people's annoyance with it, and I do find it kind of dumb in future installments, though another major difference here is the inclusion of RPG elements to this game, where Lara gets XP for killing enemies, which eventually leads to the accumulation of skill points that you obviously want to use to buy skills. There's also a salvage system in this game where you pick up materials that allow you to upgrade weapons, and all this is pretty standard fare nowadays. But I do feel like back in 2013, finding these sort of systems in a non-RPG game was a pretty unique feature, and definitely one for a cinematic action-adventure game like Uncharted. But with that is most of what I have to say about the general gameplay. Now let's talk about the main campaign, which does start with Lara setting off for her first expedition, heading into the Dragon's Triangle to find the lost kingdom of Yamatai, until the ship she's aboard of ends up getting caught in a storm, leaving her and the other passengers isolated on an island, with the entire game taking place on this island. And I really love the concept of this game, with the entire game essentially following Lara Croft's growth as a character, perpetuated by her attempts to escape this island, with that being the game's only setting, and it allows for the narrative to remain relatively focused here, while also giving this game its own unique tone. But upon being shipwrecked on the island, Lara gets separated from the rest of the group by being knocked out by someone, and I don't feel like it's ever explained who this guy is, but either way, we awaken in a cave, leading to the first gameplay section of now escaping the cave, giving us an introduction to the more grim but realistic tone this game exudes, where we instantly see Lara getting impaled and is seemingly in a weakened state that makes you feel vulnerable while playing as Lara, not feeling like this action heroine that she seems to be in the OG games. And while again, I get how that can be underwhelming, I do think this game does a decent job at developing Lara's character to get to the point where she is more in line with the original games. But this is followed by the initial set of puzzle and platforming sections, leading up to Lara picking up the trail of her friends and finding an abandoned camp where she starts her first campfire, and watches a video from a camera she had found in her friend's bag, which allows us to get introduced to the other side characters in the game, who I really don't care about. I mean, to me, Lara is the only character of note here, and while Jonah is a character that becomes prominent in future games, he doesn't really get much to do here. Roth, Sam, and Whitman are all important characters to the story here, though I never found them to have much depth, and really just found them to be more so plot devices than actual characters, while all the other characters just feel like fodder to be killed or to be assistants to Lara at points within the story. But following this, Lara has to go off to find food, coming across a deer but has nothing to hunt it with, until she conveniently finds a dead body with a bow and arrow. Again, making this her signature weapon in this game, but again, one that I do think serves a narrative purpose. Being a more stealthy and weaker weapon, being a nice representation of Lara's strength and also confidence in herself that grows across this game. But eventually Roth is able to contact her through her walkie-talkie, where again Lara is clearly traumatized and wants Roth to come and save her, only for him to have to motivate her to come and find him, with this location now being the planned rendezvous point for the survivors. But again, this scene showing Lara's starting point with her lacking confidence in herself, which we do see her develop from by the end of the game. But moving forward, she ends up finding her best friend Sam alongside a man named Matthias, who ends up being the main antagonist in this game, and very clearly so here, with him coming off as really creepy and poorly acted at that. But also, I don't understand how they weren't startled by this guy's appearance. Now, Sam does say here that he is one of us, making it seem like he's feigning to be someone from the ship. I felt like through that video, it felt like it was implied that we just knew everyone on the ship, where this just makes this kind of dumb. But here we have Sam telling the story of Himiko, the Sun Queen of Yamatai, which I wonder if that will become relevant. But strangely, Lara ends up passing out unexplainably, so that's kind of dumb, leading to Matthias and Sam having disappeared, setting up Lara's upcoming rescue of Sam that does take up a bulk of this game. But after being attacked by wolves, Lara is eventually rescued by the other survivors, only for them to immediately split up, with Lara being paired up with Whitman to search for Roth. But following this, they do shockingly discover that this island is in fact Yamatai, and that its island inhabitants worship Himiko, which, I mean, who would have guessed? But instantly we do see Whitman talking about using the island to make a profit, clearly coming off as a self-interested character here, one that clearly was going to betray the group. But this leads to them being captured and us getting this stealth section with Lara with her hands tied behind her back until she is captured once again, giving us this pretty disturbing scene of her attacker trying to sexually assault her, to where she ends up stealing his gun and is forced to kill her first human. Again, being a moment of development for her, being this loss of innocence, though also a scene I remember causing a lot of controversy, with this sexual assault being looked at as a gratuitous scene. Though again, I do feel like this does have a narrative purpose here, as a representation of Lara's transition into needing to kill when she has to, and even then, like, I don't even feel like the scene is that explicit, with Lara fighting back almost instantly and killing her captor, so this is a controversy I never fully understood. But this does lead to Lara getting her first gun, making her first kill, and does lead to the start of combat encounters in this game, which we get a pretty lengthy section of them leading up to our finding of Roth, who has now been injured, and after patching him up, tasks Lara with reaching the top of a mountain to send an SOS. Again, having Roth motivate her despite her lack of confidence, and also ending up giving Lara his climbing axe, which ends up being a pivotal tool for traversal moving forward. And really, we do end up getting a lengthy bit of gameplay here trying to get to the radio tower with not much happening narratively, but eventually Lara does contact the outside world and a plane does arrive to rescue them, but obviously it can't be that easy, as a storm strikes down the plane, now making it clear there's clearly an entity haunting this island. But after returning to Roth, we do see Lara's guilt over leading the pilots to their doom, where despite Roth's warnings of needing to make sacrifices, and telling her that what she has experienced is loss, not sacrifice, which I thought was a nice moment, Lara still decides to go off on her own to rescue a surviving pilot. Again, already showing her development, where before she had to be motivated by Roth to really do anything of substance, while now she starts going off to do what she thinks is right. Though even here, the game makes this come off as pretty misguided, where she finds the surviving pilot only to fail in actually saving him, coming off as an incorrect decision for Lara here, though along the way we do have Lara learning that Sam has been kidnapped by the island's inhabitants, it being a cult named the Solari Brotherhood being led by Matthias, where again, the antagonists in this game don't really have much depth to them, it just very much comes off as one note to me. But again, this rescue mission ends up ending up with Lara being ambushed, only for her to be saved by the intervention of these samurai-like creatures called the Oni, clearly connecting this back to the story of Himiko, and this is where we learn about the Ascension ritual that will decide the Sun Queen's successor, with Sam clearly being kidnapped to fill that role. Now, after escaping in another massive set piece, Lara is contacted by Sam, who tells Lara where she's located, making the next objective to rescue her by infiltrating the Solari fortress. But along the way, Lara gets critically injured, leading to us needing to find supplies in a nearby helicopter to heal her. This ends up being a pretty annoying gameplay section where Lara's movement is severely hampered, with any attempts to jump or climb are accompanied by Lara losing health, and this all ends up leading to a pretty brutal scene of Lara having to patch herself up. This all leads us to the shantytown portion of the game, which ends up being a pretty lengthy, annoying section of combat encounters, with most enemies here having automatic weapons and will throw Molotovs at you, and that just ends up being annoying. But eventually you do end up meeting back up with Grim, one of the more underdeveloped fellow survivors here, and eventually he ends up sacrificing himself, which this game tries to prop up as this big emotional moment, but really it's like, who cares? We knew this guy for like 2 minutes. Again, just not that notable of a character here, though I guess it's impactful for Lara's character, considering this is the first of her friends to die across this game. But this leads to Lara being at the entrance to the palace, where Roth ends up helping her from afar, with us getting this tedious section of having to cross the bridge from underneath and having to avoid detection by waiting for Roth's go-ahead. But eventually we conveniently arrive just in time to see Matthias conducting the ritual, where Lara fails to stop it, though it does end with the confirmation that Sam is the chosen one here. But obviously Lara ends up getting captured, through which we have to escape by jumping into a pool of blood, which leads to this really over-the-top visual, but ends up being another annoying gameplay section, with Lara now being back to only having a bow and arrow and having to navigate through this massive set of caves infested with enemies. And while there is the ability to use fire arrows to cause these massive explosions that can be pretty effective here, I do still find this entire section to be pretty tedious to play. But eventually we end up rescuing the other survivors in what is this ridiculous looking cutscene of their awkward cheering, but in rescuing them we do end up blowing up the entire caverns below the fortress, leading the entire area being set on fire, and us getting this massive set piece as we head into the burning palace to rescue Sam, where along the way we do end up finding Whitman, who is just freely walking around, having made a deal with the Solari and not seeming to care about the safety of the group. But he does still end up helping us find Matthias, and we get this really funny scene between Matthias and Sam, where again Matthias is acting so bad here, but we do find out his motivations here, where he, like the others, are stranded on this island and wants Sam to become the new Sun Queen to allow him to leave, which I still don't find Matthias to be that compelling of a villain here, where it never feels like they actually ever attempt to add some complexity to his character, him just constantly being obsessed tasked with kidnapping Sam and conducting this ritual. But after rescuing Sam here, this ends up leading to what is probably the most tedious sequence of combat sections in this game, where we attempt to escape the palace and we get a lot of combat encounters that have very little cover. And I always found myself running out of ammo during these sections, which can make this not particularly fun, especially considering it feels like these fights never end. But this section does end up concluding with now a helicopter arriving on the island to save them, which Lara and Roth get aboard, only for it to be struck down once again. And it is here where Matthias arrives to end up killing Roth, who is given this heroic death scene, though one that feels extremely generic, and one that, I mean, you could obviously see coming. Like, I feel like it was so apparent that Roth was going to die here, and a way to progress Lara's character. But this also ends up giving Lara personal vendetta against Matthias, and adds to the overall stakes of the narrative. Though this is followed by the survivors regrouping after Roth's death, having a nice farewell to him, though this also ends up being a pretty unlikable scene for Reyes, with her blaming Roth's death on Lara, which the fact that Reyes is one of the few characters that survives this game is extremely disappointing to me, considering how much she sucks. But Lara ends up separating from the group once again, where the others decide to fix a boat to try to escape, while Lara recognizes the pointlessness in that, with Himiko clearly stopping anyone from leaving this island. Though really, I mean, at the end of the day, the real reason why Lara gets separated here is just to allow for more gameplay sections on the way to the shore, but eventually regrouping with them at the shore does lead to Whitman arriving as well, claiming to have escaped, though again, has clearly turned on the group, and Lara even picks up on that here, though they don't do anything about it because Reyes tells them that she doesn't care about the issue between Lara and Whitman, which again just shows how much she sucks. But learning that Alex went to the wreck of the Endurance to salvage tools for Reyes, Lara decides to go after him, getting the compound bow and later the rope ascender along the way, essentially being the last tools to be added to Lara's arsenal here, where the island becomes fully explorable due to that. But eventually we do end up meeting up with Alex, who has gotten trapped under some rubble, where he gives Lara the tools and ends up sacrificing himself, because that's this game. And I get its connection to the previous scene with Roth talking about the importance of sacrifice, but it still feels ridiculous that pretty much half of the starting group in this game end up sacrificing themselves in order to help Lara here. Also in the farewell to Alex, she ends up giving him a goodbye kiss, because I guess this was a relationship we were supposed to care about. But either way, we make our way back out, to which the addition of the rope ascender does make the return a lot less tedious, as you are essentially just retreading the same area. But following this, Lara then sets off once again to go to the research base to learn more about the storms, again showing her initiative at this point, with her being resolute and this being what she needs to do, again being a direct contrast to earlier in the game, though also feels like a largely unnecessary story for the narrative. One that feels like was just added here to have Lara leave the group, allowing Whitman to kidnap Sam, because obviously. Though this does end up giving us one of the more notable puzzles in my eyes, of you having to drop this elevator through destroying its brakes, and I've always liked that one, though really this entire section feels like a pretty artificial deviation from the core plot. But this brings us to the final mission, which has Lara, Jonah, and Reyes heading to the monastery to rescue Sam, where almost instantly we do have Whitman being killed by the Oni, which is a pretty funny way for his character to go, just anticlimactically being killed here. But this mission ends up being a pretty decent mix of the different gameplay styles, having some notable climbing sections, a solid final puzzle for the game, and also a lot of enemy encounters, with most of them having you fight against the Oni, who end up being stronger than your typical enemies, and through that kind of remind me of the Guardians in Uncharted 2, with them just being annoying to fight against. Though here we do find out that the Ascension ceremony is not one to crown a new queen, but instead transfer the soul of the original into a new body, obviously upping the stakes now and needing to save Sam before this ceremony occurs. And when reaching the top, we do end up getting the final boss battle in the game against a random giant Oni, which feels really weird and pretty anticlimactic that the final boss is against this enemy that just randomly shows up here. And really it's also a pretty easy fight, as all you need to do is dodge its attacks and shoot him in the back a few times. But with that, we do reach the end of the game, where we get a series of QuickTime events to wrap up our fight with Matthias that does end up with this great moment of Lara essentially becoming the Tomb Raider that we know, where Matthias shoots away her bow, leading to Lara pulling out two of her guns, and we get this final bit of gameplay and barraging him with bullets, and giving us this iconic visual of Lara taking him down with two pistols, and this obviously leads to her saving Sam in what ends up being a mostly happy-go-lucky ending, with them escaping alongside the other survivors. Though the game ends with this typical opening up of a sequel with Lara saying she isn't going home just yet, with there being other secrets she needs to find, where again, I assume that they always intended on continuing on with Lara's story here, but I don't personally feel like it was necessary. I feel like this game did what it needed to do for a Lara Croft origin story. It shows her development across this game to the point where she ends this game with the bravado and the iconography of the OG games. She's already paved the path to becoming the Tomb Raider, and now after having seen what they've done in the sequels, I just don't feel like they do anything to add to Lara's character that wasn't already added over the course of this game, making the continuation of this story here feel pretty pointless. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire game of Tomb Raider 2013. Again, a game I do still have a lot of reverence for, especially from a gameplay perspective and how it innovates upon the Uncharted formula, while also providing a mostly fun gameplay experience and a competent narrative. And I do still find this to be an enjoyable game to go back to, despite it not being as strong as I remembered. With my overall opinion on the Survivor trilogy having gone down over time, with again those following games just feeling pretty pointless to me. And maybe down the road I'll talk about them more in depth to talk about my reasons why, but it is due to that this easily becomes my favorite game in the rebooted Tomb Raider series, with this one feeling like it has a focus and a purpose that I do think is void in those future installments. But there we go. I mean, that's the video. Those are my thoughts on Tomb Raider 2013, 10 years after its initial release. And obviously expect the same style of retrospectives down the road. Over now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.